Imagine pulling up to a military base gate, a place that's supposed to represent honor, duty, and respect, only to be told you don't belong there because of the color of your skin. Picture this. A black man in civilian clothes drives his Tesla to the main entrance of Fort Harrison Army Base in Virginia, presents his credentials, and is immediately met with hostility, suspicion, and outright racism from the very people sworn to protect all Americans. The guard doesn't check his ID properly. He doesn't verify his clearance. He just sees a black man in an expensive car and decides right there that this man is lying, that he's stolen the vehicle, that he has no business being anywhere near a military installation. And when this man calmly insists he has every right to be there, the guard calls for backup, accuses him of trespassing, and threatens to have him arrested. But here's what that guard didn't know, what nobody at that gate knew in that moment. The man standing before them wasn't just some random civilian. He wasn't just a veteran. He was Colonel Marcus Webb, a decorated Army officer with 23 years of service, a Bronze Star recipient, and as of 6 months ago, the newly appointed CEO of Webb Defense Solutions, a private military contracting firm with a $200 million contract with the United States Department of Defense. And he was there that day, dressed in plain clothes, specifically to conduct an unannounced inspection of base security protocols. The same protocols that were now being used to racially profile him. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story, this painful, infuriating, but ultimately triumphant story, starts long before that morning at the gate. It starts with a man who dedicated his entire adult life to serving a country that still couldn't see past the color of his skin. Marcus Webb grew up in South Memphis, Tennessee, in a neighborhood where the sound of gunshots was more common than the sound of opportunity knocking. His father died when he was 9, killed in a factory accident that the company ruled operator error to avoid paying compensation. His mother worked 3 jobs to keep Marcus and his 2 younger sisters fed, clothed, and in school. She used to tell him every single night, "Marcus, baby, you're going to be somebody. You're going to rise above all this. But you've got to work twice as hard, be twice as good, and never ever give them a reason to doubt you." So that's exactly what he did. Straight A's through high school, full ROTC scholarship to Howard University. Graduated top of his class, commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant at 22 years old. And from that moment on, Marcus Webb became the model of military excellence. He served 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. He led his unit through some of the most dangerous operations in modern military history, never losing a single soldier under his direct command. He earned the Bronze Star for valor, the Purple Heart after taking shrapnel while pulling 2 wounded soldiers to safety, and the respect of every man and woman who ever served alongside him. He rose through the ranks faster than almost anyone in his cohort, captain by 28, major by 33, lieutenant colonel by 37, and finally, full colonel by 41. Along the way, he earned 2 master's degrees, one in strategic studies, another in business administration. He became an expert in defense logistics, military contracting, and operational security. And when he retired from active duty after 23 years of service, he didn't just fade into civilian life. He built something. Webb Defense Solutions started in a small office in Alexandria, Virginia, with Marcus, 2 former Army buddies, and a dream to create a contracting firm that actually gave a damn about the people doing the work. A firm that hired veterans, especially black and brown veterans who were often overlooked by the big defense contractors. A firm that paid fair wages, provided real benefits, and treated people with dignity. Within 3 years, WDS had grown from a 3-person operation to a company with over 200 employees and contracts with the Department of Defense worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They provided logistics support, security consultation, and training programs for bases across the United States. Marcus Webb had made it. The kid from South Memphis who wasn't supposed to amount to anything had become a millionaire, a CEO, a man of influence and power. But here's the thing about being a successful black man in America. No matter how many degrees you earn, how many medals you've been awarded, how much money you make, or how much you've sacrificed for your country, there will always be someone who looks at you and sees nothing but a threat. Someone who assumes you're a criminal, a liar, or someone who doesn't belong. And that's exactly what happened on the morning of April 15th at 06:47 hours at the main gate of Fort Harrison Army Base. Marcus had been contracted by the Department of Defense to conduct a comprehensive review of base security procedures at Fort Harrison. The contract specifically called for unannounced inspections to test how personnel responded to various scenarios, including credential verification, threat assessment, and adherence to military protocols. Marcus decided to conduct his first inspection in plain clothes, jeans, a casual button-down shirt, and a light jacket, to see how gate security would handle a civilian with legitimate clearance credentials. It was a standard test. He'd done it a dozen times at other bases. He pulled up to the gate in his Tesla Model S, window down, ready to present his credentials. The guard on duty was a young white man, early 20s, with pale skin that flushed red easily, close-cropped brown hair, and a name tag that read PFC Dalton. Private First Class. Dalton looked at Marcus, then at the Tesla, then back at Marcus with an expression that Marcus had seen too many times in his life, suspicion mixed with contempt. "Can I help you?" Dalton said, his tone already dismissive. "Good morning," Marcus said calmly, handing over his military-issued credentials card and his business ID. "I'm here for a scheduled appointment with Base Command. My clearance should be in your system under Web Defense Solutions." Dalton barely glanced at the credentials before handing them back. "Yeah, I don't think so. This gate is for authorized military personnel only. Civilian parking is around the east entrance." Marcus kept his voice steady, professional. "I understand that, but I have top-level clearance for this facility. If you check your system—" "Sir, I'm going to need you to turn your vehicle around," Dalton interrupted, his hand moving to rest on his sidearm. "This is a restricted military installation." And there it was, the hand on the weapon. The universal signal that said, "I see you as a threat." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his composure. 23 years in the Army had taught him how to stay calm under pressure. "Private, I'm asking you to verify my credentials in your system. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm the CEO of Web Defense Solutions, and I have an active DoD contract with this base." Dalton's face twisted into a sneer. "Right, and I'm the Secretary of Defense. Look, I don't know what kind of scam you're running or whose car you stole, but you need to leave, now." Stole. The word hung in the air like poison. Marcus felt the familiar burn in his chest, the same burn he'd felt 1,000 times before when someone looked at him and saw a criminal instead of a decorated officer. When someone assumed the worst because of his skin color, but Marcus had learned long ago that anger wouldn't serve him in moments like this. So he took a breath and tried again. "Private Dalton, I need you to contact your commanding officer. Tell him Colonel Marcus Webb is at the gate for his security inspection. He'll verify everything." But Dalton wasn't listening anymore. He was already on his radio, calling for backup. "Yeah, we've got a situation at the main gate. Black male, approximately 45 years old, 6'2", driving a Tesla, claiming to have clearance he doesn't have. Possible stolen vehicle. Requesting immediate assistance." Marcus sat in his car, hands visible on the steering wheel, knowing that any sudden movement could escalate this situation into something dangerous. And within 90 seconds, 2 more guards arrived, a stocky white man in his 30s with sergeant stripes, name tag reading SGT Brennan, and a younger black woman, a specialist, name tag SPC Torres. Sergeant Brennan approached the driver's side window with his hand also resting on his weapon. "Sir, step out of the vehicle." Marcus complied slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Sergeant, there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Colonel Marcus Webb, CEO of Web Defense Solutions. I have an appointment with Base Command for a security inspection. My credentials are valid, and if you'll just verify—" "Save it," Brennan said, cutting him off. "We get people like you all the time trying to talk your way onto base with fake IDs and stolen cars. You think we're stupid?" "People like you." Marcus heard those words clearly. He saw the way Brennan looked at him, not as a fellow soldier, not as a superior officer, but as a criminal. And he knew in that moment that nothing he said would matter until someone higher up the chain of command intervened. Specialist Torres, the young black woman, looked uncomfortable. She glanced at Marcus, then at the credentials he was holding, then back at Sergeant Brennan. Sarge, maybe we should verify his ID in the system before... Did I ask for your opinion, specialist? Brennan snapped. When I want your input, I'll let you know. Torres fell silent, but Marcus saw something in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or at least doubt about what was happening. Meanwhile, Private First Class Dalton was circling the Tesla, peering into the windows like he expected to find evidence of a crime. Nice car, he said mockingly. Must have cost someone a lot of money. Too bad it's not yours. Marcus felt his patience wearing thin, but he forced himself to remain calm. Sergeant Brennan, I'm asking you one more time to verify my credentials. Call base command. Ask for Colonel Richardson. He's expecting me? Brennan laughed, actually laughed. You're really committed to this story, aren't you? Listen, buddy, I've been doing this job for 10 years. I know a con artist when I see one. You're not the first guy to show up here with a nice car and a fake story, and you won't be the last. At this point, several other vehicles had begun to line up behind Marcus's Tesla, actual military personnel trying to enter the base for their shifts. A few drivers got out of their cars to see what was causing the delay. Among them was a white man in his 50s wearing army fatigues, clearly an officer based on his bearing. What's the holdup? The officer called out. Brennan turned toward him. Just dealing with a trespasser, sir. We'll have him cleared out in a minute. The officer walked closer, and as he did, his eyes landed on Marcus, and something shifted in his expression. Surprise, confusion, and then something that looked like recognition. But before he could say anything, Brennan had already grabbed Marcus by the arm. All right, that's enough. You're coming with me until we sort this out. If you resist, I will place you under arrest for trespassing on a federal military installation. Marcus allowed himself to be led toward the guard station, his mind racing through his options. He could call his office and have them contact base command directly. He could call his lawyer. He could even call his old commander, General Patterson, who was now stationed at the Pentagon. But part of him, the part that had endured a lifetime of this treatment, wanted to see how far this would go. Wanted to see if anyone at this gate would do the right thing before he had to pull rank. They put him in a small holding room inside the guard station, basically a concrete box with a metal bench and a single fluorescent light. No windows, no air conditioning, just him and his thoughts. Through the thin walls, he could hear Brennan and Dalton talking. You really think he stole that car? Dalton asked. Come on, man, Brennan replied. Look at him. You think a guy like that can afford a Tesla? He's running some kind of scam. Probably trying to scope out the base for his gang or something. Gang. Marcus closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. 23 years of service. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, 2 master's degrees. CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. And to these men, he was just another black man who must be a criminal. Meanwhile, outside, Specialist Torres had pulled up Marcus's credentials in the system. And what she saw made her blood run cold. Sergeant? She called out, her voice tight. You need to see this. Brennan walked over, irritated. What is it, Torres? She turned the computer screen toward him. His credentials are legitimate. Marcus Webb, retired Army Colonel, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Defense Service Medal, current CEO of Webb Defense Solutions, active DoD contractor with top-level clearance for this facility. And according to this, he's here for a scheduled security inspection authorized by base command. The color drained from Brennan's face. Dalton, who had been leaning against the desk, stood up straight, suddenly looking like he might throw up. That's not possible, Brennan stammered. He was black, Torres said quietly, her voice laced with anger and disappointment. That's what you were going to say, wasn't it? Before Brennan could respond, the officer who had been waiting in line, a lieutenant colonel named Matthews, walked into the guard station. Where is he? Matthews demanded. Where's Colonel Webb? Brennan pointed toward the holding room, his hand shaking slightly. Sir, there was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Matthews's voice was sharp enough to cut steel. You detained a superior officer? Do you have any idea who that man is? He didn't wait for an answer. He walked directly to the holding room and opened the door. Marcus was sitting calmly on the bench, elbows on his knees, looking up as the door opened. Colonel Webb, Matthews said, standing at attention and saluting. Sir, I apologize for this treatment. I'm Lieutenant Colonel James Matthews. I've read your file. It's an honor to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. Marcus stood slowly, returning the salute. At ease, Colonel Matthews. Though I appreciate the sentiment, this is exactly the circumstance I came here to observe. Matthews looked confused. Sir, this inspection wasn't just about testing gate security protocols, Marcus said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. It was about testing how personnel respond to someone who doesn't fit their expectations, someone who doesn't look like what they think a CEO or a colonel should look like. Matthews's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to barely contained fury. You mean to tell me this was a deliberate scenario and they still racially profiled me, threatened me, accused me of theft, and detained me without proper verification? Marcus finished. All because they took one look at me and decided I was a criminal. By now, Sergeant Brennan and Private First Class Dalton had realized the gravity of their situation. They stood outside the holding room, both looking like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. Marcus stepped out of the holding room and looked directly at them. Gentlemen, I want you to understand something. I didn't come here today to trap you. I came here to see if the Army I served for 23 years had made any progress in addressing implicit bias and racial profiling. Based on what happened today, the answer is clearly no. Brennan tried to speak. Sir, we didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't bother to check, Marcus interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. You saw a black man in an expensive car and you immediately assumed I was a criminal. You accused me of theft. You threatened me with arrest. You put your hand on your weapon as if I were a threat. And even when I told you exactly who I was, you didn't believe me. You called me a liar and a con artist. The guard station had gone completely silent. Even the radio chatter seemed to have stopped. Do you know what message that sends? Marcus continued. It tells me that no matter how much I've sacrificed, no matter how many medals I've earned, no matter how successful I become, there will always be people who look at me and see nothing but the color of my skin. Dalton, the young private, looked like he might cry. Sir, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Marcus turned his full attention to the young soldier. Private, a mistake is forgetting to check your email. A mistake is misreading a map. What you did was make a judgment about who I am based entirely on my race. That's not a mistake. That's racism. And in the military, that kind of behavior gets people killed. The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Just then, the door to the guard station burst open, and in walked Colonel David Richardson, the base commander, a white man in his early 60s with silver hair, a weathered face, and the bearing of someone who'd spent 40 years in the Army. He took one look at the scene and immediately understood what had happened. Colonel Webb, Richardson said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. I heard what happened. On behalf of Fort Harrison, I offer my sincerest apologies. Marcus nodded curtly. Colonel Richardson, I wish I could say I was surprised. Richardson turned to Sergeant Brennan and Private Dalton. You two. My office, now. And someone get me the security footage from this gate for the last hour. As Brennan and Dalton filed out, looking like they were walking to their own court-martial, which, honestly, they probably were, Richardson turned back to Marcus. I know nothing I say can excuse what happened here today, but I want you to know that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated at my base. With all due respect, Colonel, Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. It already was tolerated, because this isn't the first time something like this has happened on a military installation, and we both know it won't be the last. The only difference is that this time the person being profiled had the rank and the resources to fight back. But what about the black private fresh out of basic training who gets treated this way? What about the black contractor who doesn't have connections at the Pentagon? What happens to them? Richardson had no answer for that, because they both knew the truth. Those people got turned away, got humiliated, got treated like criminals for the crime of existing while black, and most of the time nobody ever heard their stories. That's why I'm here, Marcus continued. Not to punish two ignorant soldiers, though they absolutely deserve consequences for their actions. I'm here to force this institution to confront its own biases, to look in the mirror and admit that we have a systemic problem. Over the next 2 hours, Marcus conducted his inspection, but it wasn't the inspection he'd originally planned. Instead, he interviewed every guard who'd been on duty that morning. He reviewed the security footage. He examined the protocols for credential verification, and what he found was damning. The procedures were clear. Verify all credentials in the system before making any determinations about access. But those procedures had been ignored the moment Brennan and Dalton decided, based solely on Marcus's appearance, that he couldn't possibly be who he claimed to be. The most revealing moment came when Marcus interviewed Specialist Torres, the young black woman who'd tried to speak up. "Why didn't you push harder?" Marcus asked gently. Torres's eyes filled with tears. "Because I'm a specialist, sir. Brennan's a sergeant. If I'd contradicted him too forcefully, I'd be the one getting written up for insubordination. That's how it works when you're black in this army. You learn to pick your battles, because if you fight every instance of racism, you'll be fighting every single day." Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, because he knew she was right. He'd lived that reality himself for 23 years. The constant calculation of how much prejudice you could challenge without destroying your own career. The exhausting work of being twice as good just to be seen as half as worthy. "That needs to change," Marcus said firmly. "And that's exactly what I'm going to make happen." By the end of the day, Marcus had compiled a comprehensive report with video evidence, witness statements, and a detailed analysis of the systemic failures that had led to his detention. He forwarded it directly to the Department of Defense, to his contacts at the Pentagon, and to several military oversight committees. But he didn't stop there. He also sent it to the press. 3 days later, the story broke. "Decorated black colonel detained at military base in racial profiling incident," read the headlines. The video footage went viral, showing the moment Marcus calmly presented his credentials, the moment Brennan put his hand on his weapon, the moment they led him to the holding room without proper verification. The outcry was immediate and intense. Veterans groups demanded accountability. Civil rights organizations called for systemic reforms. Members of Congress launched investigations. And at Fort Harrison, Sergeant Brennan and Private First Class Dalton faced court-martial proceedings for dereliction of duty, violation of military protocols, and conduct unbecoming. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with just punishing 2 soldiers. He pushed for broader change. He worked with military leadership to develop mandatory implicit bias training for all security personnel. He advocated for clearer protocols that required credential verification before any detention. He helped establish an oversight committee specifically focused on discrimination complaints at military installations. And most importantly, he used his platform as a successful black CEO to amplify the voices of other black service members who'd faced similar treatment but didn't have his resources or connections. 6 months later, Marcus was invited to speak at the Army War College about leadership, discrimination, and accountability. The auditorium was packed with officers of all ranks, many of them white, watching as this black man who'd been treated like a criminal stood before them as a colonel and a CEO. "I want to be clear about something," Marcus began. "What happened to me at Fort Harrison wasn't exceptional. It wasn't a one-time occurrence by 2 bad actors. It was symptomatic of a larger problem that we, as an institution, have failed to adequately address. Racism in the military doesn't usually look like burning crosses or hate speech. It looks like assumptions. It looks like lowered expectations. It looks like a hand moving to a weapon when a black man presents his ID. It looks like someone deciding, in a split second, that a person of color couldn't possibly be qualified, couldn't possibly be successful, couldn't possibly be telling the truth." The room was silent. "I served this country for 23 years. I bled for this country. I earned my rank through sacrifice and dedication. And yet, when I showed up at that gate, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the color of my skin. That's the reality that black service members face every single day. And until we're willing to confront that reality head-on, until we're willing to admit that we have a problem and take concrete steps to fix it, we'll keep failing the very people who've sworn to defend this nation." When he finished, the applause was thunderous. But more importantly, the conversations that followed were honest, uncomfortable, necessary. As for Sergeant Brennan and Private Dalton, Brennan was demoted and reassigned to a non-security role with mandatory counseling and bias training. Dalton received a formal reprimand, was required to complete extensive education on implicit bias and military protocol, and was placed on probationary status. Some people thought the punishments were too lenient. Others thought they were too harsh. But Marcus had a different perspective. "Those two soldiers are not the enemy," he told a reporter who asked about the outcome. "They're products of a system that never properly trained them to confront their own biases. What happened to me was wrong, and they needed to face consequences. But the real work isn't punishing individuals. It's changing the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place. And that work continues." Because 6 months after the Fort Harrison incident, Marcus received a call from a young black Army captain stationed in Texas who'd been passed over for promotion despite exemplary service. A month later, a black female sergeant contacted him about being repeatedly profiled by military police on her own base. The stories kept coming, each one a reminder that one viral incident and one high-profile case weren't enough to solve a problem that had been embedded in the institution for decades. But Marcus refuses to give up. Web Defense Solutions now has a scholarship program specifically for black veterans pursuing business degrees. He's on the board of 3 military reform organizations, and he makes a point of mentoring young black service members, telling them the same thing his mother told him all those years ago in South Memphis. "You're going to be somebody. You're going to rise above all this, but you've got to work twice as hard, be twice as good, and never, ever give them a reason to doubt you." But then he adds something his mother never could. "And when you do rise, when you do become somebody, use that position to make sure the people coming up behind you don't have to work twice as hard just to be seen as equal. Because that's not a standard we should accept. That's an injustice we need to fight." The story of Colonel Marcus Webb didn't end at a military base gate in Virginia. It began there. It began the moment he was forced to confront, once again, the reality that in America, being black means always having to prove you belong, always having to justify your existence, always having to be twice as good just to be seen as half as worthy. But it also showed that change is possible when people refuse to be silent, when they document the injustice, when they use whatever platform they have to demand better, when they turn their pain into purpose and their anger into action. If you believe these stories matter, if you believe that accountability and justice are worth fighting for, then subscribe to Axiom USA because we're going to keep telling these stories until things actually change. Marcus Webb didn't get justice because the system worked. He got justice because he had the rank, the resources, and the courage to fight back. But justice shouldn't be a privilege reserved for those with power. It should be a right guaranteed to everyone, regardless of the color of their skin. That's the lesson of Fort Harrison. That's the challenge for all of us. And that's why Marcus Webb's story, painful, infuriating, but ultimately hopeful, needs to be told.